In the name of the living God, amen. Please be seated. Before seminary and before I was ordained a priest, I had the privilege of serving for 8 years at Washington National Cathedral, just about a mile away, maybe less. And they were 8 long years that were very interesting, and we experienced a lot of change in my time. We went through the Great Recession. We lost about at least 2/3 of our staff during that time. No time in my tenure, however, was as exciting and as vibrant as the final couple of years before I left for seminary, working under the then dean, the former dean, the Reverend Gary Hall. And Gary Hall was quite a leader and quite a priest, and I have been seeking to follow in his footsteps in the way that he followed in his mentor's footsteps years prior. He came into the priesthood through the social justice movement of the 60s. The first time he stepped foot into a church was the Sunday after Dr. King's assassination. And in working with him, in my very first one-on-one meeting with him, I described to him the experience I had had over the 5-6 years of working at the cathedral as an out gay Christian, and the fact that the cathedral still at that time, despite the diocese allowing it and despite District of Columbia allowing it legally, was not allowing same-sex weddings at the cathedral. And in his very first meeting with me, he said, "Well, I will inform the chapter at our next meeting that that's changing, and if they don't like it, then I will resign." And he did exactly that. It was after the Newtown massacre in Connecticut, where those 20 children died, that he spoke out against gun violence. And this kind of standing up for marriage equality, speaking out against gun violence and for sensible measures that would curb it, was kind of a renewed practice in the life of the cathedral. It wasn't the first time ever. Go back to Dean Sayer in the 60s, and then Bishop Walker in the 80s and 90s. But it had kind of been a little dormant under the deans prior to Dean Hall. And his practices and his leadership were not well received by everyone in our community, certainly beyond the bubble of DC, but in our own community and on our own staff. I have this vivid memory of sitting in a senior staff meeting after all the news coverage of Dean Hall's preaching in response to the Newtown massacre, where we were really understanding we have a moment here. We're in the news cycle. We have a voice. We can use this bully pulpit. What is our role? And a colleague of mine on senior staff questioned it. He used lots of interesting words, and he was a theologian, a deep thinker, and just challenged in general, what is the church's role? Why are we doing this? Trying to imply that it was not right. And Gary responded, and I have taken this lesson to heart, and I am about to connect this to our passage today. He called that a false choice. And he used diplomatic words too to respond to my colleague, but said, I just have to name what you've just described as the false choice that it is. It is not just the choice between being the church and being evangelical in the lowercase sense of that word, or being a church that stands up for the values that we see in our gospel, that shape and have something to say about our political life. It's not just this either or. That is a false choice. The premise is flawed, so I'm not going to respond. And this idea of a false choice, it was the first time I'd heard that phrase before. And many years later now, and having done some work and some reading, it's a pretty common theory for social scientists. You can call it the either-or fallacy, a false dilemma, a false dichotomy. It shows up in lots of ways in our culture and our language and the ways we think, our brains work, in this either-or mentality, a black and white kind of thinking, an all or nothing thinking. My personal favorite, the now or never mentality. In essence, this is exactly what the Sadducees present to Jesus in our passage today from the Gospel of Matthew. It's a false choice. It's a false choice that they present to him to either support the law of Moses the Old Testament, the scriptures that were Jesus' own scriptures, the Old Testament, to either support what's taught there about levirate marriage, or to say that the resurrection is actually real. Levirate marriage, what is it? It's based on chapter 25 from the book of Deuteronomy that dictates what should happen if a man dies who then has a widow and they hadn't yet had any children. So levirate, the word coming from the Latin levere for the word brother-in-law. So it maintains that a childless widow should marry their husband's brother so that she could go on to then bear a child through the brother, but technically by law call it the deceased husband's child, and then they could inherit the estate. The Sadducees' question is not sincere, though. I think it's a false choice. It's designed to trick Jesus into either condoning a woman having multiple husbands or to denying that the resurrection is real. The Sadducees anticipate a theoretical problem without realizing that resurrection implies a different set of priorities, a different kind of concern. Marriage is a concern of this life and this time and place. The resurrection is about something else. It's about spiritual communion that surpasses our earthly bonds and relationships. Jesus was someone who was accustomed to responding to the false choices presented to him. In the scene immediately prior to this one, the Pharisees, another sect of religious leaders at the time, took their turn at trying to trick Jesus into answering the complex question. Oh, well, should we pay taxes to the emperor since our allegiance to God should be above all else? And he says, we'll pull out the coin. Whose face is on the coin? Oh, the emperor's. Well, then give the emperor's to what is the emperor's and give to God what is God's. Jesus recognized a false choice when he was presented with one. And in a way, Jesus' entire public life was a response to the false choice of the social norms of his day. In other words, his lifestyle as a single, unmarried, itinerant, poor preacher who moved from town to town to town to spread this sense of love that he had come among us. It was a subversive lifestyle. The norm would be to be married, to follow the Jewish traditions, and most of Jesus' followers themselves were also unmarried. And this is because, as scholar Amy Jill Levine points out, in Matthew's worldview, so the writer of the Gospel of Matthew particularly writes about membership of the church is not based on descent. It's not based on whose family lineage you're a part of, or geography, or where you live. It's not based on those things. Membership in the church is based on baptism, it's based on faith, and especially, as Jesus says and again, it's based on doing the will of God. Loyalty to Jesus, in Matthew's point of view, will inherently disrupt family tradition and norms as we currently understand them. And we have to talk about the woman in this hypothetical scenario for a moment. We wouldn't be doing justice as a parish to this new women's lectionary that we're using if we didn't name the passivity that is in this scenario in the first place. That's a false choice. A false choice for a woman who had no choice in the situation she found herself in. So this reading, Matthew's version of it anyway, doesn't show up in the regular lectionary that churches across the world use. Since this past Advent, we at St. Margaret's have been using a new lectionary called the Women's Lectionary. The creator of that lectionary programmed or appointed this text here in Eastertide. In the regular lectionary, Luke's version shows up somewhere in the middle of summer. But why does she appoint it here? She points out that there's this false choice, marrying and being given in marriage. The way that she translates that last part, for all the men had her, really highlights the passivity here, that the woman had no agency. If anything, she was an object. And so Gafney writes in her own commentary on this text, while her voices and the voices of other women who were forced into marriages are missing, what might the end of those marriages and those endured by their foremothers have meant to them? Might it in fact be good news? So since that meeting with Dean Hall, and in praying over this text all week, I've all these false choices in our corporate life, in my personal life, have been jumping off the page to me. And that problem of gun violence that I first had the exposure of working around in 2012 is still one that we live with today as a country. The false choice between supporting our Second Amendment, supporting the right to own a gun, or to take all the guns away and curb gun violence through sensible measures. It's a false choice. Last year, Roe v. Wade was overturned. And the false choice that we as a culture continue to live with, the two extreme opinions of being all pro-life or all pro-choice, live on. The false choice in our day increases over and over again every time the temperature globally rises. The false choice is presented between the idea that we can somehow pause that rising or turn it around versus the idea that any practices toward that end will inherently destroy our economy. This morning, Diana was leading and I sat in for the first half of our new round of St. Margaret's Go, our newcomers class. And we talk about our life experiences, and I could relate to a lot of what was shared about the false choices that we experience even in church. The false choice about how we read the Bible, that it's either all literal or it's just all a fantasy. The false choice between the church's primary mission being to evangelize and make more disciples and send them out to preach and make more and more disciples versus the choice of being all about social justice, and Jesus was just a great hippie who we should follow what he taught. Or, yes, we will baptize you in this tradition, but it means you need to sign on the dotted line saying you support all the above, which includes a narrow view of human sexuality. Or, yes, we want you to be faithful to this tradition and you are beloved to us, but we won't ordain you because you're gay or a woman. I haven't even gotten to the false choices in our personal lives, but the two that stick out to me most are those kinds of narratives we tell ourselves in our head. I think when we present ourselves with a false choice and we come to convince ourselves that those are the only two options that we've come up with so far, usually there's a third. Jesus invites us to see beyond the constraints of these false choices and dichotomies and to instead consider the possibilities that are not yet imagined. Maybe a third option from the one we first consider. Maybe it's not about staying in that job that's draining the life out of us or assuming that if we leave we'll become poor. Maybe it's not about staying silent in the relationships that we are challenged in versus assuming that if we say something we'll end up alone. The final thing I want to leave you with is to consider this text in the context of the Bible itself and the narrative, and the context where we're reading it today in Eastertide. This text we've just read, Jesus is already in Jerusalem. You see it's from chapter 22, so we're almost getting to the end of the story. And this is a big day for Jesus. He's just arrived to Jerusalem the day prior, what we commemorate on Palm Sunday, the triumphant entry on the donkey with the waving of palms, and he goes to the temple and he cleanses it. Now it's Tuesday, and already he's sparred with the Pharisees about the tax thing. His authority has been questioned again and again. He's been teaching in parables, and then this little episode we've been talking about now, and after this, he goes on for several more chapters to preach his kind of final sermon, his final series of teachings to the disciples, including that wonderful chapter 25 parable about the goats and the sheep, in which he teaches us that the way we treat the least among us is the way we treat Christ himself. The following day is Wednesday when he goes to have dinner in Bethany, and the woman comes and anoints his head. I preached on that a few weeks ago, the Last Supper before the Last Supper. And then we know the rest. Maundy Thursday, Last Supper, instituting the Eucharist, being arrested, being tried, being crucified. In this final week in Jerusalem, the most critical of false choices is on display. Between being the kind of Messiah that they expected him to be, this all-powerful, army-leading Messiah who would conquer Rome and all of Israel's enemies, or to give up and to give in to the power of Rome and the religious leaders of the day by succumbing to failure. Jesus knew it was a false choice. And we have the gift of knowing that as well. For we are reading this today in the context of this season of resurrection, these great 50 days of Easter in which we celebrate new life and new birth. Resurrection is God's answer that defies the expectations of dichotomous thinking about salvation. Resurrection defies expectations. It surpasses all that we had previously imagined was a viable option. Resurrection happens each and every time we get up. This morning when I heard the rain, I was like, okay, here we go. Resurrection happened when I, yet again, said, Christ, I want to follow you and renew my faith and allow a new spirit to move within us day after day. I pray that we may all come to recognize the false choices in our midst, and that we may allow Jesus to lead us to that option that we didn't even think was possible. Perhaps then we will be like the crowds who heard this episode with the Sadducees and be astounded by what happens. Amen.